Welcome back. Like I said last time, we're going to talk about shape. Can you tell I'm recording these like all back to back? That's totally what's going on. All right. Shape, you should all pretty much know what we mean by shape. Remember when I talked about shape in the overview, I pointed out the difference between thinking about shape as an area defined by a perimeter or just an area that's seen because it changes in value or color at the edges. Perimeter first is like putting up a fence and filling it with dirt. So the fence is the more important thing in terms of order. It came first. When we're dealing with shape in this class, we may approach it that way, but I want us to try and always be thinking about it in an area first way. That's more properly shaped. This is thinking about things in line. This is thinking about things in terms of shape first. So instead of putting up a fence and filling it with dirt, we would just like pile up dirt to create a shape if we were filling an area. And if we wanted to, we could put a fence around it in the end, but we don't even need to do that because it would just be defined by where the dirt stopped, or in this case, the white stops and the black starts, and that's why we see the shape. So I want us to continue trying to think about shape area first when we're dealing with it. There's a few different definitions we need to go through of different types of shapes. The first is geometric shape. That's any figure or area closed by a boundary, which is created by combining a specific amount of curves, points, and lines. So basically mathematically defined objects. Squares, circles, triangles, octagons, anything like that. Organic shapes, these are irregular, non-geometric shapes, and they need not resemble any living organism. So something like this, soft curved lines, not your standard math shape. A subset of organic shapes are biomorphic shapes. These are shapes that would resemble a living organism. So here we got like flamingos and flowers and an orange. There's also a difference between what's called rectilinear shape, which is shapes that consist of straight lines and sharp edges like this, corners being turned, and curvilinear shapes. These are soft, obviously flowing curved lines. So here in this Sarah Morris piece, we've got all rectilinear shapes. They're also geometric shapes for the most part. And then here in this curvilinear shape painting by Charlene von Heil, there's one rectilinear spot here. But you have some biomorphic shapes, these rabbits, they have rectilinear elements in them. Then you just have these curvilinear organic shapes pretty much all over the place. And then you have some curvilinear geometric shapes. So just because it's geometric doesn't mean it's rectilinear. A sphere is a curvilinear geometric shape. And you could have rectilinear shapes like these that aren't necessarily geometric. A shape like that, yes, you could measure it out mathematically, but it's not a standard mathematical. Like you wouldn't say, here's an octagon. That's just like some weird ribbon shape. So they can be mixed and matched. That's why we have separate definitions. Looking at this Kazimir Malevich painting, Suprematist Composition 1916, you can see that he's working with geometric shapes, just rectangles. So it's all also rectilinear. There's like one rhomboid figure here. Something else that he's playing with is, I know I'm talking about the difference between line and shape in terms of area or perimeter. He's working entirely in area, but he's also pointing out that lines are just shapes. Remember, a proper mathematical line has no width, which means we wouldn't be able to see it. So a line, what most of us would call a line like this shape here, is actually just a really long rectangle. And I think Malevich is asking that question a little bit, like why is this a line and why is this a shape? Why is that a line and why is this a rectangle? How thick does a rectangle have to get before it's no longer a line? So there's a bit of confusion, I understand, with some of that, and I think Malevich is purposely playing with those ideas. Here we see a piece by Arshile Gorky. This is pretty much organic shapes. There's not anything in here that I would say is biomorphic. I mean, you can maybe see like some eyes and a mouth of a little weird fish creature or something. But these are mostly organic shapes. They're mostly defined by changes in color, so their area first. But there are some rectilinear shapes, and those rectilinear shapes and some of these other shapes in the drawing do have a perimeter, a line around them. So he's playing, here we have like a white line, a black line, and then the area. So he's playing a little bit with all the different aspects here. Rectilinear, geometric shapes, triangle being a geometric shape, line first shape, area first shape, and combining those into a playful composition. I'm not even going to try and pronounce what this is called. You can figure that out on your own. Kara Walker, she's someone who would do these silhouette shapes. And here you can see, obviously, she's mostly doing biomorphic shapes. I don't know exactly how we would handle clothes. Probably organic shape is what we would call clothes. But mostly biomorphic shapes with the figures and the plants. Now, we're going to be doing a silhouette assignment as well. So this is a good image to look at. One of the interesting things about silhouettes, and Kara Walker uses it to her advantage, is they flatten everything down. It's like the shape version of outline, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute, how it relates to the idea of outline. But because of that, like with outline, we lose the sense of overlap. We lose the sense of what is in front of what, and that creates spatial ambiguity. Now, Walker is using this to make a critique about racism. So she's putting these figures together in ways like this one here especially looks like someone performing oral sex. But we don't know what this line here actually is. That the figure, the person on their knees could actually be like 2 feet in front of or behind this figure, and that could just be like a piece of belt sticking out, or the figure back here could be like chewing on a piece of grass or something like that. You know, this looks like a woman squirting babies out over here, but again, we don't know because of the way that there's not any spatial detail what's actually going on here. These could be plants, they could be frogs jumping around, it could be any number of things. Like, who knows what's going on up here. Here we have this weird thing where it looks like there's a kid up the lady's dress, but again, there could just be a kid standing next to the lady in front of or behind. You know, there's nothing that actually says that has to be under the dress. So Kara Walker is saying that if you're seeing something like oral sex here, or you're seeing a baby, a lady squirting out babies, that's because you have some kind of predetermined bias that's making you interpret it that way than the other way. Like, why is the first thing you go to seeing the kid up the lady's dress rather than the kid standing on the other side of the lady or leaning on the lady's big dress? So when we play with silhouettes in the assignment, that might be something you want to take advantage of, the ambiguity of the image. Now, if we extend shape into 3 dimensions, that's what you'd get called mass. And you'll see here we have Tony Smith's Untitled is a rectilinear geometric shape. Henry Moore's would be a 3-dimensional organic curvilinear shape. And then Michelangelo's Moses would be mostly curvilinear. Obviously the chairs and stuff are rectilinear, the book is rectilinear, but most of it is a biomorphic shape and an organic shape on the clothes. We, like I have said before, don't really deal with mass in this class unless we're talking about how to use things like line and shape and value to create the illusion of mass, but it's good to know the relationship between mass and shape. Now, like we talked about with outline, there's a psychological principle, and this is part of the Gestalt psychology theory that I talked about when we talked about line as well, that's called the figure-ground relationship principle. This is the same idea of humans going in and trying to separate out an object from its background. We're going to, for the sake of making reality easier to navigate, say, well, I want to make sure that I know whether I'm going to be eaten or whether it's something I can eat. And if everything merges together into one big mass, that's not very helpful. If I had no way to determine that the monkey was different than the trees, that's not very helpful. I'm going to get eaten pretty quick, and I wouldn't make any babies to have an ancestor. So this is just a property of perception, and it has more to do with your attention than anything else, in which there is a tendency to see parts of a visual field as solid, well-defined objects standing out against a less distinct background. That basically just means you're paying attention to this and your brain is just filling in the rest of the stuff. You're not seeing the actual details of leaves. Your brain is just filling in what it thinks it knows about leaves. And so that allows you to expend all of your mental calories on paying attention to the important thing, the monkey. So when we're talking about line, we would say the outline is the thing that separates one from the other. When we refer to this concept of figure-ground relationship in shape, then we talk about figure or positive shape, positive space. This is the shape that the subject of your attention is going to create. So in this case, the monkey. It's usually, but not always, in the foreground. Here you'll see that there are actually leaves in front of the monkey. So the monkey's in the middle ground, and the shape here gets cut off. So in terms of just shape, it's a little bit of a weird shape. It's not going to match my idea of monkey very well. The rest of it matches monkey all right. I think without seeing this, I would have been able to guess this is a chimpanzee. The other side of that coin is the ground, the background, which we call negative shape or negative space. And that's pretty much everything else but what you're paying attention to. It's all the stuff you're ignoring. It doesn't just mean the background. Like in this case, we're ignoring the leaves, so that becomes part of the background. Now, we don't always have to do the figure white and the ground black. We can reverse that. If you reverse that, then you basically get a black silhouette. You'll see here in this image by Frank Miller, the guy that did the Sin City comic books that they based the movies on. He built a style around drawing only the negative spaces. When you're drawing negative space, it's really great because it forces you to focus on shape. You can't go around and do a whole outline of the figure and all of that. It's just, if you're creating this area of the drawing, say here, the best thing to do would be to just draw a triangle. Then you draw this shape next to it. Then you draw another little triangle there, and then you draw this shape here, because you're filling in the black, not the white. So that's a good example of flipping your mind over into shape first versus area first versus perimeter first. Perimeter first is going to want to go do an outline all the way around all of this stuff. That's a complicated task. But if I can just look at each shape on its own and see how they fit together, that's a little bit more simple. Another thing that's important is, even though we tend to be not paying attention to these shapes because they're not representations of the objects of our attention, they still fill up the picture plane. They still subdivide the picture plane. So they're very important to compositions, how you balance compositions. So when we look at this, one of the 36 views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai, the great wave off the coast of Kanagawa, you'll see that the figure, the positive shape, the thing that we're paying attention to that we would say is the subject matter of the piece, it's the wave and the people in the boats, and then Mount Fuji back here. The negative shape, which is the sky and the words up here, this is what most people would ignore and never even pay attention to. But it's a very purposeful decision to make this like the same shape as the wave going the opposite way. And you can see it plugs into the wave here, and it creates basically like a yin-yang symbol. So he's able to embed some sense of philosophical ideas and content into the image. It's also, like I said, it's just another shape that's in the picture. It's within the rectangle of the picture plane, and it interlocks with the shape. Any shape that's on there, they're going to interlock to create some kind of puzzle. And so you need to be thinking about them when you're working on your compositions. Here you'll see people doing logo designs, playing tricks with negative space. So this one up top is I believe this is from Italy, Elettrodomestica. It would be like we have PG&E, they have ED in Italy. Now the designer of this logo is playing with negative space and what's called figure ground reversal. We'll pay attention to that in a second. We'll look at that more closely to create a clever logo. We have the E in the negative space of the white and the D over here, but then the negative space in the E, which is black, combines with the shape of the D to make what looks like a plug that would go into your electrical outlet in your wall. So it's got the two letters of the company, and it's got a logo of what the services they provide. Similar with FedEx. In FedEx, obviously a shipping company, so the designer did something a little odd and scooted all the letters together. Usually we have space between the letters. When we scoot the letters together, that makes us pay more attention to the negative space in between them as well. And in this case, it allowed the designer to use the E and the X to create an arrow. So that's representing the idea of shipping things out. And they were very clever in using the negative space for that. Because we don't tend to look at negative space, a lot of people have probably overlooked this and never even seen this. We're so focused on what we normally pay attention to, which is letters, that we just say FedEx and we go about our day. There's like half of reality out there, half of every image you're looking at are these negative shapes that you're tending to ignore. So we need to develop an awareness of them. Now, the figure ground reversal phenomenon. This is a psychological phenomenon in which the viewer's attention switches the relationship between figure and ground. So what's happening here is your brain can choose to make the black the figure and the white the background. And if that's the case, then you will see two faces that are about to kiss. You can switch that and consider the white to be the figure and the black to be the background. And then in that case, you would see like a chalice, a cup, like an old medieval cup. The bowl of the cup here on the sides and then the base of the cup. Now, it's another problem with the human psyche and human attention. And I know we're getting 15 minutes into the lecture here, so your attention span's probably going. Slap yourself, wake up. We have bad attention spans and we can only focus on one thing at once. So it's almost impossible for us to see both at the same time. We can flip-flop in between seeing the cup and the face, but we're either seeing one or the other at any given time. We can, like I said, we can flip-flop per second, but you can only hold one thing in the figure and one thing in the ground. The brain can't do both. With this idea of figure and ground, in design we want to think about also integrating. When we have things like this, it's either one or the other, and it makes very flat images. They can be very powerful, like with the logos, but they're also flat. They don't have much of a sense of space. So integration is when the positive and negative shapes flow in and out of each other and create a more integrated sense of space. So we can start stacking ground against figure against ground against figure, or figure against ground against figure against ground. Here you'll see that we start out with the white being the ground and the black being the figure, the positive shape, the white's the negative space. But then back here, the white becomes the figure, the positive space, and the black becomes the ground. And then the white figure up here merges into the black background back here. And so you get an integration between the positive space and the negative space, and that locks them together. And you'll see it creates a nice rhythm between the painting. Now you can do this more or less, like it's a spectrum of integration. This one is a very harsh integration right here. It could be seen as a bite taken out of the table, but we're probably just going to make the assumption that it's more bottles, because that would make more sense. Here with these three images, these three drawings by George Seurat, we can see different levels of integration and some nice tricks that he's playing. In the first one, it's pretty much like the last image we saw. There's not much integration. It's the white's the back, or the white and the light gray are the background, and the black is the foreground. There's some integration down here where the values of the figure, the grays here blend into the grays here. Now in this image, because of the way there's light, dark, the white is the background to the figure here, but then on this side of the figure, the white is the figure and the black is the background. So it creates a nice little like 4-part rhythm between white, black, black. And then on this image, the embroidery, the drawing of the artist's mother, you'll see that there's big areas where the figure bleeds into the background, but then there's also changes in the grays that make it white again against the dark background. Here you have the hair and the shirt and the background and the chair all bleeding together. You have like the table in front of her coming to a point with the hands. And so it's a little bit more unclear which shapes are where in certain spots. So this is a highly integrated image. This is a pretty integrated image, but there's some pretty nice big divisions also along here, integrated here. And that's not a very integrated image. We want to think of this in terms of a spectrum. If we start overlapping shapes, we can get what's called intersection. Now this is another one of those things like closure, where our brain is going to make the easiest assumption. It's not very likely that I'm going to say, look at this shape here, and then these two triangular shapes, and then this bent triangle shapes here, and then this weird like hat shape here, the most likely thing is my brain's going to see 4 circles that are overlapping each other and have some kind of different transparencies in them. That's going to cause these intersection illusions. So what we'll tend to do is we'll tend to see the most sensible shapes, these 4 circles. We're less likely to see like this eye shape in the middle, the bent eye shape there. You know, that there's an eye shape here, or especially to take any one of these areas of color in general. Intersection can be pretty interesting when you're dealing with negative space. You can just flip, you know, here the black is the ground and the white is the figure, and then you just flip that interaction when you get outside, so the black is the figure and the white is the ground, and it can make for some really nice high contrast designs that pop out off the page at you. It's a useful technique. And then shape can represent mass through shifts in color. It doesn't do as much as line. There's not like contour, cross contour, or anything like that. But you can see, because shapes can be filled with different colors, and you put different colors of different amounts of light and dark next to each other, you can start to get a pretty convincing representation of form. Now this one I did because it's really broken into shapes. But when we talk about shape creating mass, we're going to be focused more on value, which is a topic we'll get to next. Same as with line, there's inherent and structural shape. These are actual shapes and subdivisions within a composition. So you'll see these 2 paintings, which we've looked at before, by John Moore and Gerhard Richter. Remember, they shared a lot of formal qualities. One of the biggest formal qualities they shared in common was this long, thin rectangle down the middle. And they also share like similar proportions and similar aspect ratios, which are things that we've talked about now. Then in this image by John Moore, there's this structural breakdown of a grid on it as well. The Gerhard Richter painting kind of has that, but it's not as well ordered. So this is a very highly structured image, and it has a lot of inherent shapes. These are actual squares that are actually in the image. These are actual circles. These are actual rectangles that subdivide the structure of this image. Here it's just a little bit more of implied shapes. So in an image like this, the Absinthe Drinkers by Raffaele Jean-Francois, we'll see how these structural shapes, inherent shapes, can help tell a story. So if we look at just the content of this first, we're going to see there's 2 guys. They're obviously having a drink. Just by the poses that they're making and their facial expressions, we can tell that things aren't so great between these figures. This guy here is reaching out. He's looking more longingly at this other guy, and this guy seems to be ignoring him and a little bit irritated. So there's this sense of like quiet conflict and division between them. Now, formally, the artist reinforces the narrative content, the division between these 2, with these inherent structural shapes. So this post here makes this division of the canvas into these 3 areas. It divides it into these 3 shapes. That creates basically a prison for this guy. He even goes and puts bars on the prison down here. So this guy's been locked off. He's being ignored. You see his hand, there's like 2 sides as well. There's this guy's side and this guy's side. And his hand sneaking over here like, hey man, can you please talk to me? And this guy's sitting over here like, hell no, buddy, you're pissing me off. That's reinforced by having him off in his own boxes. So those are actual shapes that are in the painting. Now, underneath that, there is another actual inherent structural shape in the object created by this area of the wall that's painted here. Now, that shape actually creates a unification between the 2 figures, and the tension between that shape and these shapes creates some of the sense of longing that's going on in this painting, or some of the sense that these 2 people are connected. There is something going on between them. They do share a space together. It's just that shape, that space, that shape that they share has been subdivided by these other shapes more forward in the picture plane, and this one's further back in the picture plane. So it tells a very strong emotional story. Remember, we always want to be trying to use these formal devices to enhance the content. So those were actual shapes that were in the picture. Now we can talk about shapes that are implied in the picture as well. In this painting by Edgar Degas, we don't have an actual shape, but there is this pretty much easy to see triangle here where we group these figures off together and they create a triangle within the composition. So we understand them as one unit, and it makes an interesting shape in the composition. We'll talk later about how these shapes provide balance for the composition, but it does provide a shape in the composition that helps with the balance as well as story and getting across the idea of this being a family. You can see this fellow here, he's outside of the group and kind of looking in longingly, and he emerges more into like this half of a T shape over here with the horse-drawn buggy. This is due to another Gestalt psychology principle called proximity. This is just a psychological phenomenon that humans tend to group things that are closer together as being a group, and things that are far apart as being separate. So these elements here I'm going to say are one group, this is another group, this is another group, and then this is obviously very different. And then also I'm much more likely to group these three columns. I'm more likely to group these two columns together than I am to group this and this, but I'm also more likely to group all three of these columns together than I am to combine them with this. So there's two levels of proximity grouping going on in here, two levels of assumption about what counts as a group. Now we can look at this sense of grouping here and also see how this image creates some implied shapes to again reinforce narrative. So in the content of the image, we have the 3rd of May 1808. This is a painting by Francisco de Goya about soldiers coming into a village and putting everyone on a wall and shooting them. In the formal, just the shapes underneath all of this, the implied shapes and the grouping divisions that we have, you'll see how this is again reinforced formally. So we have two implied shapes, these big pointy shapes that are created by objects in the composition. So the soldiers pretty much create this shape and the point of the box there, and then the hill here and the shadow there create the shape. So that sets up this idea of conflict. And then we have another line here created by the soldiers and the guns, which puts this point right at this guy's heart as well. So it's like two sides coming together and clashing. There's these two sharp points like smashing into one another, almost like two swords coming together, and it sets up the idea of clash. There's also a implied structural division. You can see on this box here, it creates a line that separates this group from this group. Pretty much all the villagers are on this side of that line, so they're using that grouping of proximity grouping from the Gestalt theory. And then you have these soldiers fit together into one massive shape also, and they're pretty much on this side. There's a little bit of their hands going in and a little bit of this guy's shoulder, but that also reinforces this idea of conflict. And then having these two very angular shapes underneath really ramps up the tension. It really looks like a sharp, dangerous fight going on. So that adds to the fear that we can see going into everyone thinking that this fellow is about to be the next one on the pile. All right, that's just more of a look at how powerful these formal things can be. I'm trying to make that very apparent to you at the end of each lecture, that these formal things, we tend to talk about them just in terms of, oh, shapes, yeah, whatever, shapes line. But if used right, they'll really cause visceral gut reactions when you're looking at a painting or any kind of design, any two-dimensional art. And often people won't know why they're having the reaction. It's just up to you as the artist to do a good job with the formal stuff to get across the point that you're trying to make in the content. All right, that's it for shape. I'll see you back here next time. I'm going to go record it right now. We'll talk about value.